Hello, welcome back to Movie Husbands. Today we'll be reviewing Black Widow. From director Cate Shortland, Black Widow is the newest film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe and their first in nearly 2 years. Natasha Romanoff, aka Black Widow, must confront her past while dealing with old enemies and new dangers. The film stars Scarlett Johansson, Florence Pugh, Rachel Weisz, and David Harbour. So Matt, what did you think of Black Widow?
So Black Widow, I think, is very interesting because this movie takes place before the events of Infinity War and after the events of Civil War. It's pretty much right after the events of Civil War. Yeah. So I found this movie very interesting to kind of explore this in between. But I think one of the things about this movie is that I do think it fell flat on that. Seeing this movie now, it felt like there wasn't really much weight to it, and it didn't really feel like it had much meaning. And I feel like it would have had much more meaning if it took place before Infinity War and after Civil War, which it just seems out of place now. It seems like stuff we don't need to know. I think the biggest reason this movie was created is to spearhead this new character, which is Black Widow's sister. Yelena?
Sounds good.
Yelena. So I think that's the big purpose of this movie. I feel like Florence Pugh, I think, stole the show in this movie. I feel like Scarlett Johansson was great as Black Widow as always, but I don't feel like the focus of the movie was really on her. I feel like she was kind of doing her Black Widow thing, but there wasn't really much to add to her character at this point. There wasn't really anything I learned, and I feel like Florence Pugh's character I felt like that and the whole family dynamic. I really enjoyed the family dynamic.
I think it's an okay Marvel movie. I think if you take it out of the context of Marvel, I think it's like a really lesser, actually. But I think the chronology is a huge problem. I agree with you. And it's really easy to retroactively look smart, like, oh, that's where they got the ship from. There are these moments in it that don't feel very honest to me, and a lot of that has to do with the chronology, because it makes it seem like they're planning it, but they're not. They're retroactively looking like they planned it. But considering her fate in Endgame, this film would have been much more powerful had they done it earlier, and that scene in Endgame would have been much more powerful, because she kind of just feels like collateral damage in that movie. We always liked that character, but she never got her own film. She was always sharing the screen with everybody else. I agree with a lot of what you said. When I was writing notes for the movie, I wrote like 10 very stark criticisms, and then I said Florence Pugh rules though. And I thought she was so good in this movie. I can't imagine what this movie would be like without her. I think without her in it, we would be like tearing this thing apart. And not like this movie is a disaster or anything. It's not incompetently made. It's just that it's very kind of surface level, and it just feels like it kind of like quietly moves from scene to scene instead of really making an impact.
Yeah, this movie really seems like a setup. And I feel like the only purpose of that setup is setting up Yelena's character going forward in the MCU, which is very apparent by the after credit scene.
Yeah, I half expected a certain lead actress that shows up at the very end of this movie in the post-credit scene to be like, do you have a Disney Plus subscription? That's what this movie felt like to me. That being said, there are plenty of good things about it. I think all the actors are great. I agree with you that Scarlett Johansson's kind of muted in this movie. I'm not sure why. Maybe they were going for just like a kind of dark, like muted tone with her general character. That didn't really work for me. I thought David Harbour was great. I thought Rachel Weisz was great. Florence Pugh we've already talked about. The comedy in Marvel movies is something that I typically criticize just because it feels very lowest common denominator, but I felt like this movie was funnier and genuinely funnier in a character-driven way, more so than their films typically are. So that's definitely a positive for me.
Yeah, so I want to go back briefly to a little bit of what you were saying earlier and how, because this movie is taking place it seems like it's in the wrong time period. Like, we should have seen this movie earlier, in my opinion, but I completely agree with you. It seemed like certain details, like the Quinjet coming in, these little kind of homages, or how they connect in between the two movies, it just seemed like they didn't have enough weight. And I feel like one of the biggest things that Scarlett Johansson's character is dealing with in this movie is the concept of family. Mm-hmm. And whether she has family, because she's always felt like she's been like a lone wolf, just going around and doing all these things and not really have a place to go home. And I think this movie kind of tries to tackle that subject matter of whether she has a home, but I feel like it's too late for that.
Another thing that I like about this movie is I think it has a bit more, not like anything monumental, but a bit more visual flair than I'm used to in Marvel movies.
On that note, I think one of the things that is starting to bug me and we had mentioned this briefly at the theater, you had mentioned it, and I definitely want to talk about it more, was kind of the use of special effects. I think it's to the point where it was a little bit too much for me in this movie, and there was a little bit too much of it. I just want to see more practical effects, because when I see practical effects, I feel like the characters are more realistically in danger.
Totally.
But when they're falling from a building and just happening to land on a bunch of other pieces of buildings falling out of the sky and somehow don't die, to me that isn't realistic enough to hold my attention. I feel like it's a little bit fake, or it's a little bit out there.
Yeah, it's very refreshing when they actually do things practically. Like The Winter Soldier comes to mind as having a lot of practical kind of special effects and practical action sequences. But I agree. I think that their CGI most of the time is pretty good. In this movie, it was really noticeably not like bad, but noticeably fake, especially the explosions.
Yeah.
And it's not that, like, for a $200 million movie, it's not that expensive for you to do a real explosion or to flip a real car, and things like that. So I completely agree with you. And there are ways, I think, that really good filmmakers have integrated visual effects with great action sequences. Like, I think of that scene in The Last Jedi in the Red Room. That's a scene that clearly has special effects, but is also very practically made. Like, there's long times without cutting, and you have to deal with a choreography of the fight sequences. So there's ways to do this that aren't so lazy.
It's more, just to add to that, is that it's more that the special effects complement the narrative. In Black Widow, I think in particular, at the climactic scene, where this building is kind of exploding out of the sky, that becomes the main focus, and it loses focus away from the characters a little bit.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it stood out a little bit too much.
And there is some fight choreography in this that's pretty good, but they cut a lot. So it's hard to tell. Maybe they had the stunt person go in there. I'm not sure who's doing their own stunts and whatever. But it was hard to feel like anyone was in danger. It goes to the villain as well. I don't know how you feel about the villain in this movie. I don't think he was like especially weak, but he wasn't especially menacing either.
Yeah, I think in terms of the villain of this movie, they didn't really do enough time building him up. They just allude to him, and you don't really see much of him. So I don't really get his place in the movie. I don't really get his place in general. I just feel like they just put him there to make him a villain, but they don't really dive deep enough into him as a character.
This is, I guess, me and my general distaste with some things about Marvel that I'm kind of taking out on this movie. But I think lately my distaste for how they're just constantly stringing you along to the next product, like make sure you show up to the next one, make sure you buy Disney Plus, make sure you buy action figures. Like I always feel that in this movie, which makes it really difficult for me to have an authentic experience. And I think I've been feeling it more so with this level of fatigue because, one, they've introduced all these new Disney Plus shows, so you're just completely overwhelmed, or at least I feel overwhelmed with content from Marvel, trying to keep up with all of those things. But in addition, nothing really feels standalone. It feels like you're always seeing the setup or the precursor for the better thing that's down the line. And every once in a while, they deliver the better thing, which is, Avengers Endgame and the first Avengers movie. But their films, I think, are so burdened by the overall universe that I don't feel this sense of each film being different. When I think about, like, say, the Alien movies, the first Alien is directed by Ridley Scott, and it's utterly different from the sequel, which is directed by James Cameron, but they're part of the same universe, and they're standalone stories that work really well on their own, but also work well together, which these movies, I think, more and more are becoming incredibly difficult to feel stakes at all if they're not part of the universe. So I'm very fatigued with that whole thing.
That's a very interesting point to make, and there's two ways in which I'm going to respond to that, because I totally get where you're coming from, and I feel like splitting out on all the TV shows and stuff, it's like not everybody's the problem is that there's so much content, I just can't keep up. Like, I am excited to watch Loki. I haven't watched Loki yet. And it's like, but I was like on board with WandaVision like every week.
Well, WandaVision was very good.
Yeah, but the point is that it's getting to a point where, and then Falcon and the Winter Soldier came out, and it was like, you're into it was so much, and there's only so much you could keep up on in terms of the storylines and everything that's happening. So, and it kind of reminds me of, funny enough, Kingdom Hearts. And so, if you know Kingdom Hearts, have ever played the games, it's like literally all these games. It's like first you had the original games, but then it branched out onto 3DS games and a PSP game, and it's like all these games had an effect on the story with all these different characters in the universe outside of it, but all of them had an influence on the major game releases going forward. So it's like you had to get those games to kind of understand.
Yeah.
But at some point, there was like certain games that I couldn't get because I wasn't going to get a whole console, like a whole system, like a handheld system. I didn't get the 3DS system just because I wasn't going to get it just for that game. Mm-hmm. So I just watched all the cutscenes because that's the only way I could keep up with the story. But I think that's how inundated it was. It became too complex. And I still love Kingdom Hearts, but I feel like it became too complex for its own good. And so I'm hoping, I see where you're coming from in that sense. But on the other hand, I feel like that's what makes Marvel so good, is that you have this continuous storyline that is connected between all the movies. I feel like then you fall into DC territory where I feel like they're doing just a terrible job with that. That every movie is so different and feels so different that they don't connect and they're made so differently. So I get the idea of wanting a little bit more individuality out of them, but I'm also very happy and content knowing that all these movies, there's like a grander plan and that all the movies are very well connected and thought out in that way. So I'll leave that the way it is for that.
I think that another reason why I'm starting to feel this way is most of the characters I care about have kind of been dispelled since Endgame. I still care a lot about the Guardians of the Galaxy, and we'll see that movie like eventually. It's been a very long time since we've had a Guardians of the Galaxy movie, but I do look forward to that. But without, that 10 years of I care about this character and they're back now, they're kind of in this position where they have to make me care again. And I'm having trouble getting there. I know it's early in the process. We're very early in this next phase of Marvel, but I'm having trouble getting there.
All right, so you ready to go to grades?
Yeah, so I was really stuck between a C+ and a B-. I think I'm going to go with a B-. So that's a recommend. I think it's kind of a tentative recommend for me. I think it's a pretty solid watch. I was really worried in the beginning, and I think it really improved on itself. I think the ending, the last hour is better than the first hour, in my opinion, especially when the family's kind of all together and they have a great dynamic with one another. I still can't escape this feeling that this movie is kind of like The Americans if they drained it of all...
I was thinking you might be thinking that during the movie.
But The Americans if they drained it of all, narrative, character, and moral complexity. So that's a little upsetting to me. The Americans is clearly better. Watch it, people. Anyway.
All right. Well, yeah, I'm definitely going to give this a little better of a grade than you. I give it a B. I will be honest, though. I probably won't go back and watch this movie. I think it's just what this movie has to offer is there isn't much here that's going to be utilized going forward, and you get the gist of it very easily and very quickly. So I think there's nothing really drawing me to watch this movie again. But that being said, I did really enjoy myself. I do think they did a great job of setting up the characters coming forward, and yeah, I think I had a good time.
I think this movie is a C without Florence Pugh.
Florence Pugh was great.
Yeah. She's a lot of my grade.
Oh, I do want to talk about spoilers briefly.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Yes.
Spoilers.
I cannot tell you how excited I am. Every time that Julie Louis-Dreyfus shows up on screen,
yeah.
I am beyond thrilled that she is going to play a role in this new phase of Marvel, because every time, oh my God, how she's being written, how she's acting it's hysterical, and I'm dead. I'm ready for it.
Yeah, she's so funny, but so I don't know, seems kind of conniving and cunning at the same time. Her line of I'm allergic to the Midwest really cracked me up.
You were the only one in the theater.
Yeah, I don't know why nobody laughed at that. That was really funny. And that's it for our review of Black Widow. What did you think of Black Widow? Let us know in the comments, and we'll see you in the next one.